Welcome back, everyone. This is the second installment of all the cars I've owned. Starting from my very first car, my 1987 Volkswagen GTI that I built myself. And now we're going to talk about what replaced that 1987 Volkswagen. So, I covered a little bit of this in the previous episode, so we'll continue on that story. It was December 2002, exactly 15 years ago today. I just realized that. Today is December 4th, I believe, and or 3rd. I think it's the 3rd. And that makes it exactly 15 years ago to this day, which is mind-blowing. But here we are. So, I had been driving my 87 Volkswagen GTI to work. It was my commuter car. I brought it to work. I brought it to school. And it was starting to have major reliability issues, as Volkswagens often do when they get old. Hell, even when they're new, from what I've been hearing. But we won't go there. So, I was having issues with the fuel injection system just not being reliable. It had the Bosch K-Jetronic fuel system, which was a mechanically operated, electronically tuned, just a bizarre fuel system. It had no mass airflow sensor, but what it did have was a diaphragm that would regulate the amount of fuel sent to the injectors, which were continuous flow, using metering valves that were controlled by a floating plate in the air intake. And it was just a very crude system. Even for the 80s, it was really crude. But so I was starting to have a lot of issues with that car. It was rusting out. It was just a terrible car. I have to be honest with you. So I decided I had no money, and my parents weren't in a position to buy me a car or bail me out of this situation. So I had to look at what my other alternatives were. So I was 18 years old, and I had no credit history, so I needed credit. I realized that I needed credit anyway because, life was going to be happening soon, and I would need to be able to buy things like cars and houses and things. So I went to my parents one night, December 3rd, I believe, 2002, and I said, this Volkswagen is really not working out for me. And the conversation was a little more crude than that, but it was more like, this car is junk. I'm not putting another dime into it. I've spent a lot of money on this car. All the money I've earned up to that point in my life went into that car. And my parents agreed, and they said, we can help you. And I said, well, how can you help me? My parents said, look, you need credit. And you have a steady job. At the time, I was working for Walmart in the electronics department, and I was loving the job, and they seemed to love me. So it was working out for the better. I had a steady paycheck, and I was still in high school. Now, I had already enrolled into the Air Force Delayed Entry Program with a recruiter. I had already gone to MEPS and had my physical exam, and they cleared me, and they wanted me to enlist active duty that following summer. My ship date was going to be August 22nd, 2003. So I already had a plan in place, and it was going to provide me with steady paychecks. So it looked like I was going to transition from high school student to the Air Force without missing a beat in terms of paychecks. So my parents agreed that, I've been responsible thus far, so they would co-sign on a car loan for me. A lot of kids don't have this option, and I completely realized just how lucky or fortunate I was to have parents who were willing to co-sign on a car loan. However, that having been said, I would never co-sign on a car loan for anybody, for any reason. I'm an avid David Ramsey listener now, and I'm also a huge Steve Leto fan. And both of those podcasts have emphasized two things. Credit is bad, as far as Dave Ramsey is concerned, and never borrow money from anybody, and never lend money to anybody, and never co-sign a loan for anybody. And Steve Leto has emphasized much of the latter. Never co-sign for anybody for any reason, unless it's your own kid and you can pay the monthly fee if they can't. I digress. So my parents were willing to co-sign, and further, they were willing to lend me the down payment needed to obtain a car. And I had a spending limit in my head of around 10 grand. Now this was 2002. This was prior to Cash for Clunkers. So there was a very rich and vast used car market. Now I wanted something that was 5 years old or less, reliable, and preferably foreign, Asian. It could be Japanese. I wasn't looking at Hyundais back then because Hyundai was still an iffy product. Back then, I swore Hyundai would never grace my driveway, and yet I've now had 3 of them, as we'll talk about later in this series. So, my parents and I drove to the local used car lot, which was owned by a chain of new car dealers. They had a Mazda dealer, a Volkswagen dealer, and 3 GM dealerships under their belt. So they were a legitimate dealer. They were not a fly-by-night company, and I figured it would be safer to buy a car from them. And, I wasn't really well-informed, and, but you learn as you go. So, anywho, we looked at a few cars. We even looked, so this was in 2002, and some of you guys might remember Mitsubishi running a program where they would actually finance a vehicle with no payments for a year. And for me, that was quite tempting because I could get myself a brand new Mitsubishi Lancer for, $15,000 or so back then and not have a payment for a year, which was quite enticing. And I looked into it. My dad and I drove to the Mitsubishi dealership. And by the way, this is a bad idea. And this is probably what sank Mitsubishi in the end. It was a very, very, very bad thing to do, to lend all this money to subprime buyers on a depreciating asset that they were not building any equity in for a year. Just bad news bears. Don't if you're a Nissan, don't do this. I know you're one step away from doing this. Don't do it, Nissan. Your brand is tarnished enough. So we went over to the used car dealership, and I looked at some cars for under 10 grand or so. Oh yeah, the Mitsubishis, they were very strippy models that I was looking at in my price range, and I just decided it was a bad idea, and fortunately I was right. It was a very bad idea. Anyway, so we went over to a local used car dealership, and really, most of the cars that were in my price range would have been, mid to late 90s, Nissan Sentras, some Honda Civics are out of my price range because the tuner market was pricing them up really high. So, if I was going to find a used Honda, either it was beat to hell or it was overpriced, or both. So I found a car that was kind of tucked away on their lot. It was a burgundy Mazda 626 LX trim level. It was absolutely gorgeous. It was a dark burgundy. The color was called Brilliant Burgundy, and I just fell in love with it. It had chrome where it counted. Nice. It had the facelifted front end that came out in '96. And it was the last year for that body style of 626. And I hadn't really done my research, but I knew that Mazda was well regarded, roughly. And a friend of mine had a Ford Escort. that was a Mazda, had a Mazda engine in it. It was basically a Mazda vehicle rebadged as a Ford, and it was a pretty reliable car. And I'm like, well, how could I go wrong with a 626? I mean, it's basically the Ford Mondeo platform with a Mazda drivetrain. That's all I really knew about them. But anyway, so I looked at the car. It had beige interior. Beige leather interior, mind you. Leather, which, yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm rolling in it, right? Got a leather interior. The car was well in my price range at $8,500. And it was in good overall physical condition. It didn't appear to be beaten too badly. It had 54,000 miles, which was very low for a car that age. It was about 5 years old. And it just... I sat in it, and I could imagine myself driving this car for a good long time. Aside from the leather interior, it had the AM/FM cassette deck, which was a base model radio. It didn't really have any frilly options. It was automatic, 4-cylinder, 2-liter engine. Just a basic car, just a good. I felt it would have been a great car. So we took it for a test drive. It drove very smooth compared to my GTI. It didn't have the handling, but I wasn't looking for that. I was looking for something I could just make payments on and not really have to worry about too much. So there were a few red flags, a few red herrings, if you will. The interior dome light didn't work. The stereo was missing a couple of knobs. And the Carfax came back as a commercial vehicle. It was used as a commercial vehicle. So I'm thinking, well, probably leased by a corporation of some kind, or purchased and used for a couple of years and then sent back. I never did find out what that really meant. It wasn't a program car, and I don't think it was ever a rental, but it's hard to say at this point. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to buy this car. So I went into at the time they were renovating the dealership, so they had a little trailer outside they were using as an office. So we went in. My dad was there, and I don't think my mom was with us. So we hashed out the deal. We talked about, monthly payments, and they looked at I had no credit, so my dad, actually my mom co-signed, so she had to have been there. She co-signed under her name, and lent me the $500, and I drove home with that car a day later. So the car had to go in for dealer prep. It had been traded in or purchased at auction, but they hadn't done anything to it yet. So they brought it in, and they fixed the dome light issue. They fixed the radio knobs. I had that in writing that they had to do that. I think they replaced the whole stereo system with another Mazda stereo. I think they did an oil change, and that was about it. I mean, we really didn't need a whole lot. Threw an inspection sticker on it for me, and I was off on my way. I went back the next day. I picked it up. My parents took me out to dinner to celebrate at Chili's. I remember that. And I was very happy. I was very satisfied with this car, and I felt that I made a good, reasonable purchase. And then I started going on forums and looking up, what should I expect for common issues. Now, I didn't mention this. I did purchase a dealer warranty with this car through Fidelity. So I had a warranty for 2 years. 2 years and 20,000 miles or something like that. 25,000 miles. It was some number, some weird number. So I had a warranty of some kind, at least, with this car. If anything major went wrong, I felt that I was, well covered. So I started going on the forums after I bought the car, almost immediately after, and I did some research, and I found that there are two things that the Mazda 626 is known for, and one of them is, transmission failures. The other, I don't remember. That was it, though. Transmission issues were number one common on that model. The 4-cylinder with the automatic transmission. The V6 was exempt and the models with the 5-speed stick shift were also exempt from this issue. As it turns out, the Mazda 626 uses a Ford LA4EL or CD4E transmission. It was the CD4E was the part number for Ford, LA4EL was the Mazda part number. And if you go on YouTube, you can find several videos from transmission rebuilders describing the problem and why they fail so regularly. The warning signs were a harsh shift, especially when cold. I think it was a harsh second to third, and it would just get worse from there. And as it turned out, my car had that problem. It had a fairly harsh upshift, and sometimes it would just behave erratically, like it was in the wrong gear, and then it would downshift with violence. It was a terrible transmission. So I went ahead and I called the local Mazda dealership, and I confirmed that the vehicle was out of its factory powertrain warranty, and that the transmission had in fact been replaced when the car had just 15,000 miles on it. So, I'm like, great, I bought a lemon. But that's alright. I had a warranty that I purchased separately for like $2,000, and it was going to cover this if it ever did fail. So I drove the car like that for quite some time, and I actually, shortly after buying it, like right after I found out about the transmission issue, we're talking about a month after I signed the papers, I brought it to my local mechanic, and I had him flush the transmission for me. He didn't have a flushing machine, so he did a drain infill. He did one drain infill on it. And I was in the shop when he did it, and I actually was under the car with him. He was a good friend of the family, so he let me in the shop and he let me watch him do it. And what came out of that transmission smelled like the center of hell and looked like... You ever watch the Beverly Hillbillies? You know when Jed shoots the ground with his rifle and up comes a bubbling crude? Well, that's what came out of that transmission. It was blacker than this steering wheel. And our poor family mechanic looked at me, shook his head, and said, if this car makes it out of my shop under its own power, you need to buy a lottery ticket. And I'm like, why? I didn't know much about automatic transmissions. My previous car was a stick shift. My first car was a stick shift. And he says, listen, the only thing holding this transmission together right now is all the particles and clutch debris that's coming out of this sucker right now. You really should look at, he didn't really say get rid of the car, but he did say that you're going to have problems. And I said, well, okay, Syrah. So he put new fluid in it, and it turns out the car was just fine. It actually shifted a little bit better. So I sighed a sigh of relief, and I moved on my merry way. But that was definitely an eye-opening experience. And one of the things I failed to do when I bought the car, because I was so excited, and my dad, he was excited for me, and he didn't, I don't know, he just didn't mention it, and that is pull the transmission dipstick. Yeah, dipstick. And look at the fluid. If it smells like burnt toast, if it's blacker than black, don't buy it. For those of you watching this video, you're looking at your first used car, you're looking at used cars in general. If the car, because modern cars don't have these anymore, but if the car has a dipstick on the transmission, look at the fluid. It should be pink. It should be light pink. And it's going to have a weird smell to it. But a burnt transmission fluid has a very distinct smell that you know it when you smell it. It just smells basically like burnt toast. Well, anyway, if it's not light pink, it doesn't mean the transmission is bad. It could be just overdue for a fluid change. But if it's black or dark brown, probably don't buy the car. Unless it has all the warranties, and even then they might decline the warranty for lack of maintenance. And that's kind of where I was headed with this car. So Anywho, drove the car like that for a little while. I did a few repairs to it myself. So I think in the spring or summer of 2003, I did the 60,000 mile service in my parents' driveway. I did a valve cover gasket, timing belt tensioner, spark plugs, and I did a few other odds and ends, and made the car right again. And that was my second ever timing belt, and my first on a car that I owed money on. So I did all that myself, and went just fine. I had one problem when I did the timing belt. I forgot to plug in the crank angle sensor, which put me into a panic. I don't know what that was, but put me into an absolute panic because I thought I'd blown the engine and put the belt in wrong. But turns out it was just the crank angle sensor was unplugged. So anyway, so that was fun. And I did the brakes on it too. I did brakes all around. And I had to replace a valve, part of the EGR system, not EGR, it was the evaporative emissions control system. There was a valve, a little purge valve that was ticking. When I had it under light acceleration, it would make a repetitive tick, 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 tick. So I went to my local junkyard, I found another valve, I put it in, problem went away. I had my first car accident in that car, and my first slight mishap where I was driving through the snow, coming onto a main road, and I had cut the wheel, and I accelerated, and I was accelerating in a direction I didn't want to accelerate in. I turned into the slide, and that didn't help. There was a curb just too close to me. I couldn't miss that curb. It was a granite curb, and I hit it with my right front wheel. The car drove okay after that, but it had a wobble to it, and sure enough, I bent the rim. So I also went to a junkyard, and I put on a new rim, a used rim, and I actually ended up putting 4 new tires on it because they had really bad tires. So I put 4 new tires on it, and she was good as rain. The transmission continued to act really bad. I was considering filing a warranty claim with the warranty company, but I decided I was going to try to wait it out. So I brought it to a transmission, just a quickie lube place, and I had the transmission flushed, like after about 10,000 miles or 5,000 miles of owning the car, because by that point the fluid was black again. So I had it completely flushed, and within another 5,000 miles it was black again. So definitely, the transmission was definitely going out on this car. I ended up actually putting a factory Mazda CD player in it. I was tired of having the cassette adapter for my portable CD player. It was constantly breaking, and so I went out and I splurged. I went on eBay and I bought a CD, the factory Mazda CD player from the 626 and I think Protege model. It was just a factory plug-in. I didn't have to change any wiring. Just take the old one out, pop the new one in. Now I have a CD player, and I thought that was nice. I had plans for this car. I was going to find a set of factory alloy rims and replace my hubcap steel wheels with alloy wheels, but they didn't have a very good-looking rim for the 626 for that generation. They were kind of fugly, so I didn't do that. All in all, I mean, the car was enjoyable. The payments were low. I think my payments for that car were $160 some a month. That was it. Insurance wasn't too bad. I was a young driver, so it was actually quite expensive, but relatively speaking, it wasn't too bad. Reliability-wise, other than the pending doom on the transmission, I never really had any trouble with that car, surprisingly. Another thing I loved about that car, one of the few things I liked about it was it had and Mazda did this for several years. There was a button on the center stack that would switch the center climate control vents to swing back and forth oscillating vents. It was a great idea, and I don't know why it's not a thing on cars today. It was very cool. I always had that thing turned on because it would just kind of oscillate the air back and forth inside the car, and it was a nice feature. Probably not nice enough to warrant continuation, but because after that year they went to a swivel ball. And actually, it was 2 generations later when they came out with the Mazda 6. They switched the vents to little balls like the Miata has, which is a nice little touch, I guess. What I didn't like about that car, it handled like a boat. It really didn't do corners very well. It had very soft, very pliable suspension. It drank gas. It was a 2-liter 4-cylinder, and it probably got 19 miles per gallon. And it wasn't a fast car. It was very slow, very poor acceleration, especially with that transmission. So terrible in gas. It had it always smelled like it might have been leaking fuel, but I could never find a leak. I think it might have been an evap hose under the car. But on a 5-year-old car, that shouldn't be a problem. But I could never find a fuel leak anywhere on that car. It had the radiator after just 5 or 6 years. I think by the time the car was 6 years old, the radiator started to leak. The catalytic converter failed. Oh, I forgot to mention that. So shortly after I bought it, the engine light came on, and I pulled the code, and it was for a pre-cat failure, pre-cat inefficiency. So because it was covered under the, when I bought the car from the dealership, they gave me like I think it was a 30-day warranty, 1,000-mile 30-day warranty. They covered it under that warranty. And when they did that, they damaged the O2 sensor, which they had to pay for, because they, instead of taking the exhaust shield off from the exhaust manifold, they just cut it with tin snips and pulled it out. And when they did that, they nipped the wire on the O2 sensor. So I got a new O2 sensor, a new pre-cat, and a new exhaust manifold shield, heat shield, for free, which was, they did stand by the car, which was nice. But that was all within 5 years. 5 years of the car's production, which is kind of bad when you think about it, for a car like that. But hey. Now, how the car came to its end, it's a terrifying story even right now for me to tell you, because it was a very traumatic accident for me. I was young, new driver, relatively new driver, and it happened right after I came home from my short stay in the U.S. Air Force, my 3-month stint in basic training. Due to an ankle injury, they had to discharge me. So I came home to no job, no prospects, and a car loan. And I ended up landing a job at Office Max, which was about the same style work I had done at Walmart when I was in high school, but at least it was something. It was better than nothing. I needed to find a job. It didn't matter what it was. But I had a job, and so I commuted a much farther distance to this job than I had been previously commuting. And after about 2 weeks or so, maybe let's see, I started December, just after Christmas of 2003, and January 27th, so about a month after I started, I had gotten my income tax check sent to my parents' house where I was living at the time, and I knew it was going to come that day, so I drove home. Deal was, I wanted to buy a new printer. I needed a printer because I was going to be printing out resumes, and I didn't have a printer because I sold all my computer stuff when I had shipped off to the Air Force. I sold my computer, my printer, my scanner, everything. And I had to start buying the stuff back. So I was like, I need a printer so I can print resumes. So this was back when you mailed in job applications. This was a different time. So I'm driving home, and I grab my check, and I saw my dad in the garage. He was home early that day, and he said, "Hey, while you're out, can you do me a favor? And can you fill my 2 propane cylinders that I used to heat the garage?" Because he was going to be doing some work in there. And so I said, "Yeah, no problem." So I grab my check. I zip over to the bank. I cash the check. I've got the 2 propane tanks in the back of the car. And I decided, I'll just go fill these up, and then I'll head over back to Office Depot or Office Max to get my printer, and then I'll come home. So I get in the car, load the tanks, get my check cashed, got money in my hand. I bring the propane tanks to the filling place where he got the propane filled them up. Now, I would put him in the way I would, because this isn't the first time I did this for him, because as the son, it was my job to do that. So what I would do, to keep them from rolling around in the car, I would pull the seats forward, and I'd stick them between the back seat and the back of the driver's and passenger seat. I'd roll the seat up against the cylinder, which would clamp it in place. It wasn't going anywhere. And, wrapped it in blankets and such. So I had 2 full 20-gallon tanks in my car, and I'm ready to go back to Office Max to buy this printer that I wanted. But then I had a moment of, well, you know what, maybe I'll just bring these back to the house so my dad can have heat. So that's exactly what I did. I spun around, went back to the house, dropped them off, got back in my car, started back on my journey to get this printer, and I'm probably a quarter of the way there, and that's where things got interesting. So I'm driving along, and I see this black Chevy S10 in front of me to my left, coming my direction. Now, I was on a 4-lane road, not a highway, just like a highly trafficked road, 4 lanes wide, so 2 lanes in each direction with a turning lane in the middle. And I see this guy, he's pulling into the turning lane, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe he's taking a left. No big deal. And, just this routine stuff. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, he's not stopping. And he's still turning. And before I had a moment to react, bam! That was, you ever hear the expression, "I saw my life before my eyes"? The song on the radio, I'll never forget to this day. That'll be the last memory that I ever forget. That last thing I ever, on my deathbed, I'll remember that song. It was "Still the One" by Orleans was on the radio, and I just, in a moment, everything just, like, you just know, all right, I guess I'm not getting that printer today. It was a sign. So I saw the airbags go off. I felt something push at my feet, and that's really all I remember from the collision. And then I just sat there dazed, like, what just happened? Am I alive? And I'm looking, I'm checking everything. I'm still fully intact. I've got glass in my hair, glass in my clothes, and the windshield is shattered. And I'm looking around the car, and I'm going to post some pictures of this so you can see what it looked like. The interior was destroyed. The seats were destroyed. The car had such an impact, and I didn't realize this until I got out of the car, which was difficult because the door was jammed shut. So I had to kind of but I rammed it with my shoulder, just getting out of this car, and my battery's starting to go down. Anyway, so I'm kicking the door, getting it out, because I'm thinking this car is going to catch fire. Yeah, I'm going to burn alive in this thing. So I got out of it, and I just surveyed the interior. The dash was destroyed. The stereo was halfway out, or partway out. The seats were twisted, and my seat was twisted. And I'm just looking around like, what the hell? The hood was next to the car. The guy who hit me, I could see him. He was in his truck, just as dazed as I was. He was an elderly gentleman, and he had blood pouring from his forehead. And I'm looking around, there was a car behind me that had rear-ended me. There was a car over here that had sideswiped the car, because I had been kicked sideways when I was hit head-on. It was just something else, man. and I looked at the roof of the car, and it was buckling, and the whole car was just twisted, like it was bent downward in the middle. His truck, the frame was bent. The whole truck was like in a V shape, and I'm like, oh my God. I'm walking around the car, and people are stopping and asking me if I need help, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm in shock. I don't know. And in the car was every panel on the car was destroyed. It was an event to remember. I'll tell you what. There should be a Precious Moments first car accident figurine with a smashed up sedan, But that was so fun. No, it wasn't fun at all. It was terrifying. Why did I say that? But long story short, my injuries were minor. The police officer came pretty quickly, and he let me sit in his cruiser because my ankle was like throbbing, and I was still in a daze. And the guy who hit me, he had to be hauled off in an ambulance. He survived. Nobody died, just minor injuries. My injuries were fairly limited to a bone chip in my ankle, and that was largely because the pedal box was smashed into the passenger compartment. The engine and transmission, everything on this car was destroyed. It was just scrap metal by that point. There wasn't one part you could have used out of this car. I mean, it was quite a sight to see. But it held up. I mean, it did take the impact of 3 cars on a fairly heavily driven road, doing about 45 miles an hour. So for that, I thank it. So I never really saw the transmission fail, but that was going to happen at some point in the very near future, had that accident not occurred. It was kind of a blessing in disguise, really, because I was stuck in a payment on a car that was worth way more than I owed. Way less than I owed. And, in the position I was in financially, it wasn't practical for me to have a car loan at that time. So it was a blessing in disguise. The insurance company took care of me. They paid for my injuries, they paid for the car, and they gave me a fairly sizable amount of money for pain and suffering, which I used to help pay for my next vehicle. And I was at a point where I was getting ready to move into my own apartment a couple months later due to another job change. I got a better paying job, so I was going to move out with my cousin, and we were going to share a townhouse. And you're all going to hate me for this, but this was back when you could rent a 2-bedroom, 3-story townhouse in southern New Hampshire for $870 a month. Today, that very same townhouse is renting for $1,800 or $1,700 a month.
So it looks like my camera battery decided to die. So, anywho, the point of that story was to sort of prove that I could afford a very nice apartment on a meager $8.50 an hour at the time, and you really, unfortunately, can't do that again. That same apartment is renting for a lot more, and that car, you can't really buy a good used car for that kind of money anymore. I mean, you can, but it's going to be something much older than just 5 years. A lot has changed. Wages have stagnated for the most part, and the price of everything has almost doubled since 2004. So I thank you all for watching this video. Stay tuned for my next installment where we talk about car number 3. Now, car number 3, I'm not really sure what that's going to be because there are technically 2 vehicles that could fit that slot. So why don't you tune back in the next time and see what I've got in store. And the viewership on my previous installment has been pretty positive, and I think I'm going to keep doing this. It looks like you guys seem to be enjoying these videos, and I thank you for that. Until next time, keep it real.